The pump screamed. That is the only word for it. Not hummed, not groaned. Screamed, a high metallic shriek that cut across 300 acres of southwestern Kansas wheat stubble on a Tuesday morning in July of 1971, a sound so raw and wrong that 3 barn swallows abandoned their nests under the eaves of a rotting equipment shed and didn't come back for a week. And then silence. Eldon Pruitt pulled his hand back from the switch housing of his ancient Fairbanks-Morse Model 32 centrifugal pump, looked down at the cracked clay earth around the wellhead, and watched the last thin ribbon of water, barely enough to fill a coffee can, disappear into the dust like it had never existed at all. He was 44 years old. He had $340 in a coffee can buried behind his workbench. He owed the county $1,200 in back property taxes. His winter wheat had come in thin and yellow. And now his well, the only well on his 320 acres, the well his father had drilled in 1934 during the worst years of the Dust Bowl, had gone dry. He stood there in the July heat, sweat rolling off the brim of his Dekalb seed cap, and he did not swear. He did not cry. He looked east, across a barbed-wire fence line, toward the shimmering green perfection of Dale Hargrove's center-pivot irrigated fields, and he made a decision that would define the next 2 decades of his life. Let me take you to Meade County, Kansas, in the summer of 1971. I want you to feel this place. Meade County sits in the far southwestern corner of Kansas, hard up against the Oklahoma Panhandle, a place where the sky isn't just big, it is oppressive in its bigness. You can stand on a county road and see weather systems forming 60 miles away. You can watch a thunderstorm travel 30 miles across the horizon and never drop a drop on your fields. The land is flat in a way that feels almost philosophical, as if God ironed every wrinkle out of it and left it to bake under a sun that in July sits so high and so white it doesn't even cast a proper shadow until 4 in the afternoon. The Ogallala Aquifer runs beneath this land, one of the largest underground water reserves in the world, stretching beneath 8 states and holding more water than Lake Huron. Farmers had been tapping it since the 1930s. By 1971, the center-pivot irrigation systems that Dale Hargrove and men like him had installed were pulling staggering volumes of water from wells that went down 200, 300, 400 feet, and they were growing corn and milo and winter wheat at yields that would have seemed like science fiction to a 1930s dryland farmer. But not every acre of Meade County sits above the same depth of water. The aquifer's surface, what hydrologists call the saturated thickness, varied wildly from farm to farm, from quarter section to quarter section. On some land, you drilled down 200 feet and hit 40 feet of saturated rock that would pump forever. On other land, you drilled the same depth and found 15 feet of saturated material, maybe 10. And on land like Eldon Pruitt's, land that had been wrung hard and drilled shallow in the Depression when money was short and drilling rigs were primitive, the saturated thickness was already marginal before you started, and 37 years of pumping had thinned it to almost nothing. The air smells like hot clay and diesel exhaust and something faintly sweet that turns out to be the distant smell of Hargrove's irrigated alfalfa, third cutting just coming ripe. The wind never really stops. It moves the wheat stubble in long, sighing waves. It carries grit that finds the corner of your eye, the gap between your collar and your neck. This is the Kansas High Plains in 1971. And this is where Eldon Pruitt is about to do something that nobody, not the county extension agent, not the Soil Conservation Service, not the Kansas State University hydrologists who would later write about it in a graduate thesis, had ever seen done quite this way before. Let me tell you about Eldon Pruitt. Eldon was born in 1927 on the same 320 acres where he stood that July morning. His father, Raymond Pruitt, had homesteaded the land in 1918, built a 2-room soddy that he later replaced with a clapboard house painted barn red, and drilled that well by hand in 1934 when the Dust Bowl was making men choose between their land and their families. Raymond Pruitt chose both and nearly lost both. He kept the land. He kept the family. He drilled 38 feet down and found water in a limestone fracture zone that the old-timers called a sweet seam, and for 30 years that seam gave generously. Eldon was the third of 4 children. He attended a 1-room schoolhouse called Wildcat Creek School through 8th grade, went to Meade High School on a bus that took 40 minutes each way, and graduated in 1945, 3 weeks after VE Day. He was 17. He had been accepted to Kansas State on an agricultural scholarship, one of the first in his family to have such a thing offered. He turned it down because his father's back had given out, and somebody had to work the farm. He never complained about that decision, not once. Not to his wife, Ruth, who he married in 1952, not to his two sons, Gary and Dennis, not to anyone. What Eldon had instead of a formal education was something rarer and harder to quantify. He had read everything. The county library in Meade was small, 4 rooms, maybe 3,000 volumes, but Eldon had worked through most of the agriculture and geology sections twice over by 1960. He subscribed to 3 farm journals and 1 academic hydrology digest that he ordered directly from the University of Kansas. He had a particular and passionate interest in groundwater, how it moved, where it pooled, what caused it to surface, what caused it to retreat. He was a quiet man, medium height, lean in the way that men who never stop working are lean, with hands that looked like they'd been carved out of old oak root. He wore the same style of khaki work shirt from a Meade hardware store catalog every day of his adult life. He wasn't unfriendly. He'd talk your ear off about groundwater geology or the carburetor on a 1958 Farmall 560, but he didn't waste words on complaint or self-pity, and he didn't say something unless he'd thought it through first. His neighbors respected him the way you respect someone you haven't quite figured out. His crops were average, his equipment was old, his operation looked, from the road, like a man just barely staying ahead of the bank. But Eldon Pruitt had been quietly thinking about the groundwater under his land for 20 years, and when his well went dry in July of 1971, he didn't panic. He reached into a folder he kept in his desk drawer, a folder he had been adding to since 1963, and he started reading. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever known someone who was dismissed as ordinary, as nothing special, and then watched the moment come when everyone realized they'd been wrong? Keep that feeling in mind. We're going to need it. Now, Dale Hargrove. I want to be careful here because Dale Hargrove was not a cartoon villain. He was a product of his time and his success, and his time and his success had taught him certain things about the world that turned out to be wrong. But let's be honest about who he was in 1971. Dale Hargrove was 51 years old and he owned 2,400 acres in Meade County, making him the 3rd largest landowner in the county behind the Bricker family operation and a corporate farming entity out of Wichita. He had inherited 800 acres from his father in 1958 and had spent the next 13 years buying every distressed farm that came on the market within a 5-mile radius, including 2 properties he'd purchased from families who had been forced out by drought and debt, families who, as county courthouse gossip had it, felt they'd been offered less than the land was worth, but had been in no position to wait for better offers. Dale ran 2 Valley 8,000 center pivot irrigation systems, each capable of covering 130 acres in a single sweep, drawing from wells he'd drilled in 1964 and 1967, to depths of 380 and 410 feet respectively. He drove a new 1971 John Deere 4320 diesel tractor, $12,800, which he'd paid cash for, and he made sure people knew he'd paid cash for it. He was a member of the Meade County Farm Bureau, the Kansas Grain and Feed Association, and he served on the board of First Farmers Bank of Meade, which meant he was on one side of the desk for a disturbing number of conversations about who in the county was struggling with their operating loans. He wore clean clothes. That sounds like a small thing, but in a farming community where your wardrobe reflects how your season is going, Dale Hargrove showing up at the Meade Co-op in a pressed Western shirt and Wranglers with an actual crease ironed in was a statement. He knew it was a statement. He made it every time. His relationship with Eldon Pruitt was civil the way a brick wall is civil, solid, unyielding, and not particularly interested in you. The 2 men shared a fence line along the eastern edge of Eldon's property. They had never had a formal dispute. But in 1969, when Eldon had asked Dale if he might be able to purchase water, to buy it outright at Dale's price, to run through his own delivery line during a dry stretch, Dale had declined. Not unkindly, not with any particular malice, but the way a man declines when he has considered the request for approximately 4 seconds and found it beneath further thought. That well's for my operation, Dale had said, leaning on his fence post. You ought to look at getting your own situation sorted out. Eldon had nodded, thanked him, gone home. By July of 1971, when Eldon's pump screamed its last scream and went quiet, Dale Hargrove's center pivot was making lazy, perfect circles over his 3rd crop corn, throwing water in long silver arcs that caught the morning sun and turned it into rainbows. You could see it from Eldon's kitchen window if you were inclined to look. On a Friday morning, 2 days after his pump failed, Eldon Pruitt drove his 1963 Ford F-100, the one with the cracked taillight he'd been meaning to replace since 1968, down County Road 14 to Dale Hargrove's farm gate. He had his hat in his hand. Literally, he had removed it before he got out of the truck, which was a gesture anyone from that part of Kansas would read correctly. He wasn't coming to argue, he was coming to ask. Dale was in his equipment yard discussing something with his hired man, a young fellow named Kurt Biggs. He saw Eldon coming across the caliche gravel and he said something to Kurt that made Kurt duck his head and find somewhere else to be. Eldon laid it out plainly. His well had failed. He had winter wheat to get planted in September. Without any water, his dryland production wouldn't cover his taxes, let alone his operating costs. He was asking, and he used that word, asking whether Dale would consider selling him a water share. A formal legal arrangement, water purchased at market rate, drawn from one of Dale's wells through a temporary above-ground line that Eldon would install, maintain, and remove at his own expense. He had a typed sheet of paper in his shirt pocket, a proposed agreement he'd written out himself, based on water-sharing arrangements he'd read about in the Kansas statutes. He offered Dale $4.50 per 1,000 gallons, which was above the going rate at the time. He offered a formal deed restriction that would give Dale right of first refusal if Eldon ever sold the property. Dale Hargrove listened. He looked at the typed paper without taking it. He looked out at his center pivot making its slow revolution. He looked back at Eldon. And then he did something that the three people who witnessed it, Kurt Biggs, who had not gone as far away as Dale thought, and two hands working a fence line 50 yards distant, would remember for the rest of their lives. He smiled, not a kind smile, the other kind. "Eldon," he said, "you've been sitting on that land for 40-some years and you've squeezed it down to nothing. Your daddy drilled that well in the Depression and you've been running it like it was going to refill itself by prayer." He looked at the typed sheet one more time. "I'm not in the water selling business, and I'm not inclined to help a man prop up a farm that's already done." He turned to walk back to his equipment yard. "What are you going to do?" Eldon asked, quiet, no edge in it, a genuine question. Dale half turned back and there was something in his face then, not quite contempt but not far from it. "You're going to have to sell," he said. "It's just math, Eldon, nothing personal. When you decide to list it, come talk to me first." He paused. "I'll give you fair market." He went back to his equipment yard. Eldon Pruitt put his hat back on his head, walked back to his Ford F-100 and drove home. He did not stop at the co-op. He did not call Ruth from the highway phone at the gas station. He drove home, sat at his kitchen table, and opened the folder he'd been building since 1963. He read for 4 hours without stopping. He ate a cold ham sandwich that Ruth brought him without being asked, because she had been married to this man for 19 years and she understood the difference between Eldon thinking and Eldon worrying, and this was Eldon thinking. At 7 o'clock that evening, he looked up from the folder and said, "I need to call Frank Alderman." Ruth knew who Frank Alderman was. She had heard the name exactly twice in 19 years. "The one from the university?" she asked. "Kansas Geological Survey," Eldon said. "He wrote a paper in 1961 about limestone fracture zones in Meade and Clark counties. I want to ask him something about his methodology." Ruth poured him a cup of coffee and went back to her book. This, she understood, was going to take a while. "Now here is what I want you to think about while we set up what comes next." Dale Hargrove wasn't entirely wrong. By the conventional understanding of groundwater in 1971, Eldon's well was done. You didn't go back from a dry well. You drilled a new one which cost $12,000 to $18,000 depending on depth, or you sold. Those were the options as most people understood them. Most people. Here is what Eldon Pruitt knew, and I want to explain this carefully because the science of it is what makes the story remarkable. The Ogallala Aquifer, for all its vast reputation, is not a uniform underground lake. It is more like an enormously complex sponge, a formation of sand, gravel, clay, and limestone that varies in its water-holding capacity from point to point, from depth to depth. Hydrologists in the 1950s and 1960s were still mapping the aquifer's saturated thickness, how deep the water table sat below the rock's surface across the high plains, and that mapping revealed enormous variation even within small geographic areas. But underneath and alongside the Ogallala in Meade County ran something older, much older. The Permian-age limestone formations that predated the Ogallala by 200 million years had been fractured and recrystallized by geological forces over eons, and in certain locations that depended on the specific intersection of ancient fault lines and dissolution patterns in the limestone, those fractures formed secondary aquifer zones, smaller than the Ogallala, localized. But in some cases, extraordinarily productive because they were fed by different recharge mechanisms, lateral movement through the limestone itself, rather than the vertical percolation that recharged the Ogallala from surface rainfall. Eldon had been reading about this since 1963, when he found Frank Alderman's paper in the Kansas Geological Survey Bulletin, Volume 151, Permian Limestone Secondary Aquifer Systems in Southwestern Kansas, while doing his usual reading at the county library. He had written to Alderman that year, a careful letter, asking about the fracture zone patterns Alderman had identified in Meade County. Alderman had written back, a long letter, detailed and collegial, the kind of letter a scientist writes when he's surprised to get a genuine inquiry from a farmer, and pleasantly startled to find that the farmer has actually read and understood his published work. They had exchanged 4 more letters between 1963 and 1970. The critical piece of information: Alderman's 1961 survey had identified a secondary fracture zone aquifer that ran in a northeast-southwest orientation through a section of Meade County. Based on the survey's geological cross-sections and his well logs, the zone appeared to pass through or very near the eastern portion of Eldon Pruitt's property. Alderman had never drilled it. His survey budget hadn't covered Meade County extensively, and the farmers in the area had already established wells in the Ogallala Formation. There was no commercial incentive to investigate secondary formations when the primary aquifer was performing well. But there was something else. Something Eldon had worked out slowly over the years, fitting pieces together from Alderman's letters, from a 1967 study from Texas Tech on Permian limestone hydrology, and from his own careful observation of his land. His father's 1934 well, the one that had just gone dry, was drilled to 38 feet. It had always performed better than it had any right to, given what the Ogallala saturated thickness maps showed for that part of his property. It performed better, Eldon had come to believe, because it was drawing from the bottom of the Ogallala Formation and making partial contact with the top of a fractured limestone zone below. The Ogallala portion had run dry, but if the secondary limestone fracture zone was where Alderman's surveys suggested, and if Eldon could drill deeper past the depleted Ogallala, through the clay confining layer that separated the two formations and into the limestone fractures, he might find water that was not only still present but under artesian pressure. Water that the Ogallala Formation above had actually been sealing in. The cost of drilling to that depth, somewhere between 200 and 280 feet, Eldon estimated, based on Alderman's geological cross-sections, would be between $9,000 and $14,000. Money he absolutely did not have. But he had something else. His father's 1934 well bore already went down 38 feet, through the topsoil and into the upper Ogallala. And he had read in a 1958 article in the Groundwater Journal about a technique that had been used in a handful of locations in Texas and Oklahoma, deepening an existing borehole using a cable tool percussion rig rather than a rotary rig. Slower, more labor-intensive. But a fraction of the cost if you were willing to do much of the labor yourself and you could find a cable tool rig to rent rather than hire out. Cable tool rigs were antiques by 1971. The rotary drill had replaced them for most purposes decades earlier, but they still existed. Old-timers still had them, and they could be rented for $35 a day plus your own labor. Eldon Pruitt called Frank Alderman the day after Dale Hargrove's smile at the fence post. He laid out his theory. He described his father's well location, the performance history he'd kept in a notebook since 1952, the geological section from Alderman's 1961 paper that he'd had photocopied at the library. There was a long silence on the phone line. Then Frank Alderman said, "Eldon, I think you might be right, and I want to tell you something. In 30 years of geological survey work, I have never had a farmer call me with a hypothesis that was as well-reasoned as the one you just described." He paused. "Now, do you want to know what I think is your best shot at hitting that fracture zone?" What followed was 31 days of the hardest physical work Eldon Pruitt had ever done in a life that had not been short on hard physical work. He found the cable tool rig 50 miles away, owned by an 80-year-old driller named Hazel Metzger. Yes, a woman, Hazel Metzger, who had inherited the rig from her husband in 1955 and who rented it for exactly $35 a day with a $200 deposit, cash, which Eldon paid from the coffee can behind his workbench, leaving himself exactly $105 to his name. He hauled the rig home on a borrowed flatbed trailer. He spent 2 days rebuilding the cable drum brake, which was worn to dangerous thinness, using brake lining material he ordered from a farm equipment supplier in Liberal, Kansas, for $14. The cable tool method is, at its essence, the most elemental form of well drilling imaginable. You raise a heavy steel bit on a cable. The cable on this rig was a 1-inch steel wire rope, and you drop it repeatedly. The bit, weighing 800 pounds for this rig, strikes the rock and chips it. You periodically bail out the chips in water with a baler tool. Then you raise and drop the bit again, and again, and again. A good day's work with a cable tool rig might advance your hole by 8 to 12 feet in soft formation, 3 to 5 feet in limestone. Eldon worked from 5:30 in the morning until the summer sun got too brutal, typically around 11, then again from 4 in the afternoon until dark. Ruth kept his water thermos filled. Gary, his older son, who was 17 and strong, worked alongside him on mornings when his summer job at the grain elevator allowed. They deepened the old borehole, through the depleted lower Ogallala, through a gumbo clay layer that smelled like the inside of a root cellar and bit the bit back with an ugly, sucking resistance, into the top of the Permian limestone. The limestone was harder, progress slowed to 3 feet a day, some days 2. At 147 feet of total depth, 109 feet below the original borehole bottom, Eldon noticed something. The chips coming up in the baler were different, whiter, more crystalline, and there was a smell, mineral, faintly sulfurous, the smell of deep formation water that hasn't seen daylight in 10,000 years. He called Frank Alderman from the phone at the grain elevator in Meade on his next trip to town, described the chip color, the mineral smell, the drill rate change. "Keep going," Alderman said. "You're in the fracture zone, Caprock. The productive zone should open up in the next 15 to 30 feet. When it opens, you're going to know." On the morning of August 23, 1971, at a total borehole depth of 174 feet, Eldon Pruitt's cable tool bit dropped through something. Not into something, through something. There was a different sound, a hollow, almost ringing quality to the impact, and then the cable went slack in a way it hadn't before. When he raised the baler, it came up full, not damp, not moist, full to the brim with water so cold it made his hands ache to hold the baler tube. He stood there for a moment. Just stood there in the August heat, 98 degrees that day, wind out of the southwest at 12 miles per hour, smelling like dried alfalfa and highway tar, holding a baler full of ice-cold water from 174 feet below the surface of his farm. He lowered the baler again. It came up full in less than 4 minutes. He lowered it a third time, full again, 3 minutes 40 seconds. He sat down on an overturned 5-gallon bucket. He put his face in his hands. He sat that way for a while. When he looked up, Gary was watching him. "Dad," Gary said. Eldon picked up his water thermos from the ground. He drank from it. He put the cap back on. He stood up. "Go get your mother," he said. "Tell her to bring the camera." Now they needed to case the hole, seal it against formation collapse and contamination, and install a pump. The casing was standard 6-inch steel well casing that Eldon had already secured, because he'd done the math on this before he started drilling and he'd known what he'd need. He and Gary installed it over 3 days, seeding it through the clay confining layer and into the top of the limestone fracture zone, then gravel packing the annular space with filter material to protect the open hole section below. For the pump, he pulled his original Fairbanks-Morse Model 32 surface centrifugal pump from the old wellhead. It was still mechanically sound. The screaming had been a bearing, and he'd replaced the bearing for $23 from a supplier in Dodge City, and adapted it to draw from the new, deeper static water level using a submersible drop pipe and a line shaft arrangement he fabricated himself from components. On September 4, 1971, Eldon Pruitt switched on the repaired Fairbanks-Morse pump. The water came up, steady, strong, cold and clear and slightly alkaline, with a faint mineral character that told you exactly how old it was and how far it had traveled. He let it run for 6 hours straight, measuring the discharge rate with a 5-gallon bucket and a stopwatch. The yield held steady at 380 gallons per minute. For context, a yield of 200 gallons per minute is considered a good agricultural well in southwestern Kansas. 300 is excellent. 380 was extraordinary, and the artesian pressure in the fracture zone meant the static water level had risen to only 42 feet below the surface, far shallower than anyone would have predicted, dramatically reducing the pumping energy required to bring it up. The total cost $847, rig rental, casing materials, gravel pack, pump repair, miscellaneous hardware, $847. A new well drilled by a commercial drilling contractor to the same depth would have cost between $11,000 and $16,000. Eldon Pruitt had found and developed a secondary aquifer that would supply his farm and the farms of 3 neighbors who later purchased formal water-sharing agreements from him for the next 22 years. The silence when it came wasn't the silence of a crowd at a county fair. There was no dramatic public moment where Dale Hargrove watched from across a fence line as Eldon's pump roared to life. The silence was quieter and more devastating than that. It was the silence of the Meade County Agricultural Extension Office on a Tuesday afternoon in late October 1971, when Eldon Pruitt stopped in to update his soil and water use records, and the extension agent, a man named Harold Voth who had been in the county office for 12 years, and who prided himself on knowing every active well in the county, looked at Eldon's new well registration paperwork. Harold Voth read the paperwork, read the tested yield, read the depth, read the static water level. He looked up. "Eldon," he said carefully, "where is this well located?" Eldon told him. Harold Voth looked back at the paperwork. He knew that property. He knew the Ogallala saturated thickness data for that property from the county water use surveys. He knew, or had believed he knew, that the east quarter of Eldon Pruitt's 320 acres was essentially a write-off in terms of groundwater potential. "How did you," he started again, "what formation is this drawing from?" Eldon explained he'd brought copies of Alderman's papers, his own correspondence, his geological reasoning. He laid them on Harold Voth's desk. Harold Voth read for 20 minutes without speaking. When he looked up, something had changed in his face. The professional certainty had been replaced by something more complicated. "I've been extension agent in this county since 1959, he said. "Nobody has ever shown me a secondary limestone fracture zone draw in this part of the county." He paused. "Has anyone else seen this?" "Frank Alderman at the survey knows," Eldon said. "He's writing something up." Harold Voth picked up the phone. The word moved through Meade County the way important agricultural news always moved, through the co-op, through the elevator, through the coffee counter at Dillon's Diner on Main Street in Meade. By Thanksgiving, Eldon had received 3 visits from neighbors asking about his well. By the following spring, Frank Alderman had driven down from Lawrence twice to take water samples and conduct additional geological survey work. By the summer of 1972, the Kansas Geological Survey had commissioned a formal secondary aquifer study of a 200-square-mile area surrounding Eldon's property. As for Dale Hargrove, the specific moment of reckoning was quiet too. It was a February evening in 1972, at the annual Meade County Farm Bureau winter meeting, held in the basement of the First Methodist Church. Folding chairs, coffee and paper cups, the smell of floor wax and old radiator heat. The county extension agent gave a presentation on water conservation and emerging well technology. He mentioned in the context of that presentation, a case study of a secondary aquifer development in the eastern part of the county. He didn't use the word remarkable. He didn't have to, the numbers did it for him. Dale Hargrove was in the 3rd row. Several people later said they watched his face during that presentation. They said it was very still. After the meeting in the parking lot, he walked past Eldon Pruitt. He stopped. The two men stood in the February cold, breath-fogging, gravel crunching under boot soles. "I heard about your well," Dale said. "Yep," Eldon said. A long pause, the cold wind moved between them. "I didn't think that was possible," Dale said, "on your land." "I know," Eldon said. Another pause. "That was good work," Dale said, and there was something in the way he said it, not warm, not apologetic, but honest in a way that the smile at the fence post had not been. He walked to his truck. Eldon Pruitt stood in the parking lot for a moment, then he walked to his own truck and drove home. Nobody laughed now, nobody at all. Let me tell you what the ripple effects of one man's stubbornness and one good well looked like over the next 2 decades. By 1975, Eldon had formalized water-sharing agreements with 3 neighboring farms. Harlan Dutton to the north, whose own Ogallala well had been declining since 1968. The Veronica Schatz operation to the west, a widow woman farming 160 acres alone since her husband Raymond's heart attack in 1970, who became one of the most remarkable small-grain producers in Meade County once she had reliable water. And the Becker brothers, Lloyd and Pete, who farmed together on a section and a half to the south, and who had been watching Eldon's operation with intense attention since the fall of 1971. The water-sharing agreements were structured simply, the way Eldon did everything. Each neighbor paid him $3.80 per 1,000 gallons below market. Because Eldon was not interested in becoming rich off his neighbors, drew from a dedicated header pipe Eldon installed at his own expense, and provided their own delivery lines from that connection point to their fields. The revenue covered Eldon's pump operating costs with modest profit. It was not a bonanza. It was a lifeline for 4 operations that the conventional wisdom of 1971 had written off. Frank Alderman's formal study, published in Kansas Geological Survey Bulletin 196 in 1973, was titled Secondary Aquifer Systems in Permian Limestone Formations, Southwestern Meade County, Kansas. It identified 3 distinct fracture zone aquifers in the study area, established the recharge mechanism, lateral flow from the Oklahoma Panhandle Formation to the south, and estimated the sustainable yield of the combined system at more than twice what had been assumed available for that portion of the county. The bulletin was cited in subsequent state water management planning. The fracture zone aquifer that Eldon had discovered and developed was formally designated the Pruitt Zone in the survey's internal notation system, a designation that found its way into the published literature and which stands to this day in the Kansas Geological Survey databases. In 1977, Gary Pruitt, Eldon's older son, came back from 2 years at Kansas State with a degree in agricultural engineering and a thesis that had incorporated 3 summers of measurement data from his father's well. Gary took over primary management of the farm. He added a second delivery lateral, installed a pressure regulation system that improved the efficiency of the surface distribution, and negotiated a 4th water-sharing agreement with a young couple named the Hendersons who had purchased a quarter section in 1975 and were trying to establish a market garden operation. In 1981, when the Ogallala aquifer water table decline became a statewide crisis and the Kansas legislature was holding hearings on groundwater allocation, Eldon Pruitt was invited to testify before the House Agriculture Committee. He drove to Topeka in Gary's truck. His own 1963 Ford F-100 had finally given up in 1979, and he sat at a long table with hydrologists and engineers and agricultural economists, and he spoke for 11 minutes without notes. He said that groundwater management couldn't be done from maps alone, that the High Plains aquifer system was more complex and more variable than the state's management models assumed, that there were secondary and tertiary formation zones in many parts of southwestern Kansas that hadn't been adequately characterized, that the assumption that a failed primary well meant no water was, in a number of specific geological contexts, simply wrong. One of the committee members asked him where he'd gotten his geological expertise. "Frank Alderman's papers," Eldon said, "the county library, and 37 years of paying attention to the water under my land." There was a ripple of something in that room, not quite laughter, not quite the other thing. Something in between that people make when they've heard something that's both funny and true. The committee incorporated several of his recommendations into a statewide groundwater study initiated in 1982 that identified 16 additional secondary formation zones across southwestern Kansas, 4 of which became productive supplemental water sources for farming operations. As for Dale Hargrove, his operation peaked in the early 1980s and began a long consolidation as his Ogallala wells declined. He sold his eastern 800 acres in 1986 to a corporate farming entity, not to any of his neighbors, though several had offered. He died in 1993. He was, by all accounts, a man who had worked hard and built something real, and who had made one significant miscalculation about a quiet man and a dry well in the summer of 1971. The well Eldon Pruitt drilled in 1971 was still producing in 1993, the last year of his active farming. Its yield had declined from 380 gallons per minute to 290, a 24% decline over 22 years, which hydrologists who studied the Pruitt zone noted was dramatically slower than the Ogallala decline rates in the same county during the same period, consistent with the fracture zone's different recharge dynamics. Eldon Pruitt retired in 1993 at the age of 66. He handed the farm to Gary. He continued to receive the water revenue from the sharing agreements until the system was finally decommissioned in 1995, when the last of the neighboring farms upgraded to direct individual wells using the secondary formation data that Gary had by then helped characterize for the county. He died in 2001. He was 74 years old. The obituary in the Meade County newspaper mentioned his farming career and his family. It mentioned his testimony to the state legislature. It mentioned that he was a self-taught groundwater specialist, a phrase that Frank Alderman, who sent a handwritten note to the family when he heard, described in that note as inadequate but well-intentioned. Ruth Pruitt kept that note. Gary still has it. Let me leave you with something simple, because the story itself has already said most of what needs to be said. We live in a world that has become very efficient at measuring visible success. We can see the size of a man's fields. We can count his tractors. We can note the crease in his wranglers. These are easy measurements to make and they tell us something, but they don't tell us everything, and in the case of Eldon Pruitt, what they didn't tell us was the most important part. What they didn't tell us was that a quiet man in a Dekalb seed cap had been reading Frank Alderman's geological papers since 1963, that he had been carrying a theory about the water under his land for 8 years before his well ran dry and the theory stopped being academic, that the apparent failure, the screaming pump, the cracked clay, the dry hole, was not the end of the story. It was the beginning. Here is the thing about patience, about deep knowledge held quietly over many years. It doesn't look like anything until it does. And when it does, it looks like magic to people who weren't paying attention. Dale Hargrove wasn't a stupid man. He was a well-informed man who knew a great deal about farming, about water, about Meade County's geology as it was generally understood in 1971. He looked at Eldon Pruitt's situation and he made a calculation based on everything he knew. The calculation was wrong not because he was careless, but because Eldon Pruitt knew something he didn't. Something that existed in the pages of a geological bulletin in a county library that Dale Hargrove had never had reason to read. That's a humbling thing to sit with. The idea that the person we dismiss, the struggling farmer, the quiet neighbor, the one who doesn't project success, may be carrying knowledge we don't have and can't see. That the dry hole someone else walked away from might look entirely different to a person who has been reading about limestone fracture zones for 8 years. The Ogallala Aquifer is still under threat today. Farmers across the high plains are still wrestling with declining water tables, with the costs of drilling deeper, with the question of what comes next when the primary formations thin. And the lesson of Eldon Pruitt, that the answer sometimes lies in what we haven't looked for yet, in the secondary formations, the unconventional approaches, the knowledge that seems impractical until it suddenly isn't, that lesson is still available to anyone willing to read carefully and think hard. Don't judge the well by the hole in the ground. Don't judge the man by the truck he drives or the age of his equipment. And never, ever assume that someone else's problem is already solved just because the conventional answer says there's nothing left to find. Eldon Pruitt found 380 gallons per minute where the maps said there was nothing. He did it with a rented cable tool rig, $847, and 8 years of careful reading. That's not a miracle, that's just what happens when a man knows his land better than anybody gave him credit for. Let me pause here for the last time and ask you one final question. What is it that you've been quietly learning, quietly carrying, that the world hasn't given you credit for yet? Because if Eldon Pruitt taught us anything, it's this: the moment it matters will come. Be ready for it. The Forgotten Farmer is a storytelling channel dedicated to preserving the legacies of American agricultural history. Historical context is real. The Ogallala Aquifer, Permian limestone secondary aquifer systems in southwestern Kansas, cable tool percussion drilling methods, and Kansas Geological Survey research into Meade County groundwater formations are all historically documented. Eldon Pruitt, Dale Hargrove, Frank Alderman, and all other individuals named in this story are fictional characters created for dramatization purposes. Dialogue and specific events are dramatized for storytelling. Any resemblance to real individuals is coincidental. If this story moved you, leave a comment telling us about a quiet farmer, a forgotten worker, or an overlooked person whose knowledge changed something. We read every one.